Okay, welcome to Chapter 5, our lecture on sound. What's really interesting about sound in film is that obviously it wasn't always a part of film. So it was something that was added in. So the very first film to use sound back in 1927 was The Jazz Singer. And there were, a lot of experiments in synchronous sound prior to this film, but they weren't very popular and not very notable. So Warner Brothers, added sound in with a new genre by creating a new genre, the musical. And so even the jazz singer is mostly silent, but obviously the musical numbers and some of the dialogue were in synchronous sound. And so it would just like blew everybody's minds. They were like, oh my gosh, there's so many things now that we can do. So what do I mean by synchronous sound? So synchronous sound is syncing sound with picture. And we do that even today. Sound is recorded separately from picture. And I don't mean like at separate times, although sometimes that's the case. But I just mean at the same time on separate pieces of equipment. So there are people on set, their whole job is to record sound on their own devices and media and everything. And then obviously the camera department records the image on the camera media or on film. And then later in post production, those are synced together, or an assistant editor will sync it together for dailies or something like that. The problem with, back in the 1920s when they started syncing sound and image and doing synchronous recording is that, the actors couldn't move far from the microphone. So it really restricted their movement in the space and it restricted the camera movement too. So we've been talking about all of these developments in terms of like what we can do with the camera and what we can do in editing and stuff like that. But then sound, synchronous sound, kind of set us back because we couldn't move the camera anymore, and the actors didn't have as much range as they used to have in terms of moving around in the space. And that made original like talkies, like they called them, these movies that had that weren't musicals but were just synchronous sound films. It made them really boring because it was just like somebody standing in a room and talking. Like it wasn't it wasn't very interesting or cinematic. And so that's why they weren't very popular until The Jazz Singer ushered in the age of the musical. And in trying to solve some of those early problems of being restricted in space and having to stay really close to the microphone and stuff like that, um, all kinds of weird solutions were come up with. Like the camera was housed in a soundproof blimp, and that made the camera able to move silently, but still the actors were restricted. So then to help the actors move around, they placed a lot of microphones all over the set, all on separate channels, and overhead sound booms. So this is when you have the advent of the boom, and we have boom operators on set even today. An overhead boom is a microphone that a person is physically moving that follows the actor around the set. So, because of all of these problems with introducing sound, which a lot of people were just like, well, we should just not introduce sound then. But the people who did want to introduce sound were like, okay, we can figure out solutions to these problems. And some of the solutions are still to this day used. So a lot of directors were really like hostile to the idea of synchronous sound. They thought it was too restrictive and too realistic, and sort of like killed their creative process. And Eisenstein actually believed that synchronous sound was awful. He hated it so much, especially with dialogue. And so a lot of the directors who felt the same way that Eisenstein did um, kind of discovered and grew this idea of non-synchronous sound. So the idea that sound can be used selectively, not indiscriminately. And the interesting thing about non-synchronous sound is that it can be used the same way that we talked about editing being used to juxtapose two ideas or to connect thematic ideas. So if you have dialogue that you're able to hear, now you can go away from the actors and you can focus on something else that maybe causes irony with whatever they're saying. The image that you're seeing and what you're hearing the character say don't match up, or maybe they do match up, or whatever. But we can create these thematic ideas through showing something and hearing something different or hearing something that you're not seeing. And so that was the growth of sound. So it started out as this very utilitarian, now we can hear things type thing. And then it grew, like all of the things we're talking about, it grew into a more artistic tool for directors to use. And in fact, this is where you see Orson Welles start to enter the scene as a director. And he came from the world of radio, so he was very well versed with sound. And he kind of, perfected this technique of the sound montage, which overlaps dialogue from one character to another and several others. And that was something that definitely had not been used in film before. But even with all of these thematic and artistic changes, sound still made like cinema or film as an art become a lot more realistic because we can hear the things that are happening as we're seeing them. And that was helpful in a lot of ways, especially with the way that we see acting now. So acting styles became a lot more natural because actors didn't have to compensate for not being heard. In silent films, their acting was very over the top because they had to communicate emotions and ideas and tone and all that kind of stuff through visuals only instead of visuals and sound. But as sound began to be added into film, actors and directors noticed that performances could be a lot more subtle because a lot more emotion could be communicated in tone. And you didn't have to do all these over-the-top acting or expressions or whatever because you could communicate some of that stuff through just the tone of the voice or the inflection on certain words or whatever. What we think of now as acting. So then at this time, we also have the introduction of sound effects. And that was like something that obviously had never been done in film before we had sound. So we have this whole kind of like new section of the film industry that has opened up because of the introduction of sound. So sound effects are a lot different than the actual like on location sound. So the on location sound that's recorded is like dialogue and that kind of stuff. But sound effects are done later. And they're mostly just to fill the space or to hit certain plot points, like the bell rings and so now the characters leave class or something like that. So they're really more for like that kind of function in film, but they can also be sources of meaning. And so that kind of sound, so what is called cinematic sound, is constructed. It's not something that's recorded on site. So there are lots of different layers of sound that are mixed in a studio and not recorded on site. These sounds are also like not even related to the the sound or the object that you're seeing on camera make the sound. And the sound editors who create these sound effects are called Foley artists. So they gather all these different kinds of sounds necessary for a movie, and what they do is they go into a Foley pit or a sound studio, and they take all of their props, and they're on a screen, they watch the movie, and then they match up their sounds to the sound in the movie or the action in the movie that the sound needs to sync up to.
We have a shot here of a hiker coming down the waterfall, so I'm doing the sound of the carabiner and his rope and his equipment. How was that?
That was cool. So I'm going to play it back all together and see what we've got.
We really layer everything so the mixers can mix how they want to hear it. And we do things also that are a little over the top because we have to fight with music, sometimes dialogue, but hopefully when you hear it at home, it'll sound just like it should be, natural.
So a lot of these sounds are also pre-recorded, and you can if there's like a really great Foley artist who has gone to all of this trouble to make the perfect punch sound, he can sell that sound and you can buy it and you can use it in your movie. And that happens a lot. There are whole like sound libraries, especially that like post companies have. And so what you do after that is you take all of the sound that's been recorded on set. So you have an on-set field mixer who records all of the dialogue and all of the sound on set. And then you have your Foley artists who record all the sound effects. And then you have maybe like composers or whoever who make the soundtrack. And then you have a sound designer who kind of like puts all of that together. And then you have a post-sound mixer. Mix all of those sounds together so that they fit in the space in the appropriate way. And what's key about that is you have to have the speakers in the right place, you have to have the correct sound system, and you have to understand the software and the process enough to know where to place each different sound. Okay, so let's talk about diegetic and non-diegetic sound. So these are terms that are used by critics, they're not used by filmmakers, although filmmakers know the terms, but this is really a film theory or film analysis term. So diegetic sound is sounds that the characters can hear. They're sounds that are in the story. So if your character is at school and they hear the bell go off that ends class, then that's a diegetic sound. But if then as they're walking down the hall, some, popular song starts playing that's part of the movie's soundtrack, that's a non-diegetic sound. It's a sound that's not happening in the story. Sound is really useful, especially non-diegetic sound is really useful because it manipulates the audience's emotions. You can use a song that's really upbeat to get the audience's emotions kind of like really pumped up. We're excited for something. Or you can play really sad music to emphasize or underscore that this is a sad moment that's happening. And audiences aren't necessarily aware that this manipulation is happening, just like we've talked about in previous chapters. But it's a tool that the filmmaker uses in order to express a certain emotion. This is especially used in horror movies. So there are certain types of sound effects that are called stingers and drones that are used in horrors or thrillers or any kind of sequence that is supposed to build tension. And a drone is kind of that low sound that you hear in the background as someone is maybe like creeping through a spooky space. And a stinger is that really sharp, sometimes high-pitched sound that comes with a jump scare or something like that. So filmmakers can use all these different tools like pitch, frequency, volume, tempo, all that kind of stuff to emphasize certain emotions or convey a certain tone and make the audience feel what they want them to feel. So because sound is such a constant presence in film, when there's absolute silence, it is very noticeable. So absolute silence is meant to draw attention to itself. It's just as much of a tool and a decision as sound. So music as its own art form is so in-depth and complex and beautiful and artistic and has its own tools and rules and all kinds of other stuff. I mean, we could spend an entire there's an entire major learning about music, so you could spend an entire class talking about just the theory of music, just like we do in this class with film. So just trying to take a very small portion of that and talk about music in relation to film, you can use so much of that art and so much of the theory of music to add to the art of film, to also evoke emotion and create these juxtapositions and connect themes and create metaphors and reveal something about character and stuff like that. So music is really a critical part of the filmmaking process. So Eisenstein thought that music should never just be an accompaniment. It should always be an equal collaborator in the filmmaking process. And there's a film critic, Paul Rotha, who claimed that music should even be allowed to dominate the image. It should be the whole point of what's happening, and then the image, the film, should just kind of assist it in that moment. And in terms of working with a composer, the director needs to know what role the music plays in that scene or in the movie or in that moment before they talk to the composer. And then the composer becomes an equal creative collaborator in the process. And so you can have more helpful discussions, and it becomes, again, creating art. Musicals are really interesting because they are one of the most enduring genres in film, and they're very popular. And a lot of the narrative structure is just in the movie to set up musical numbers. And what's really interesting is you have some movies that can very deftly incorporate musical numbers into the narrative. So the movie Once is a really good example of this. If you watched it without the context of knowing that it's a musical, I don't think that you would realize that it's a musical because it's so cleanly integrated into the story. And that's more of what you would call like a realist musical. And just like there are realist and formalist films that are not in the musical genre, there are realist and formalist musicals as well. And some of them, the formalist musicals, are very theatric and over the top, and the realist ones are much more grounded in reality. So what's interesting about spoken language in film is that this is, along with the actual performance, this is a huge way that the actor can collaborate and contribute creatively to the film. And what's interesting here is that the writer, writes the dialogue with a certain tone and emphasis, and the director, when the director reads it, they hear it in their minds, and anybody for that matter reading it, the director hears it in their mind as a certain tone or inflection or emphasis or whatever, and the actor does too. But then when the actor performs it, the emphasis that they choose can change the entire meaning of the scene. And, speaking as someone who has witnessed this on, the many sets that I've worked on, it's really interesting when you go into a production with the idea that, I know exactly how this is going to, like, I'm so prepared, I know exactly how this is going to go, and I know exactly how it's going to sound, and I have my idea of how this will be performed. And then the actor comes in, and even with the smallest change in inflection of the dialogue, they're able to give an entirely new meaning to the dialogue or to the scene or really to the subtext of the scene. And it's really incredible. And it's one of the things that film can do better than, I'm biased, but it's one of the things that film can do better than almost any other medium, because we have the ability to get close, to understand facial expressions, and we have the ability here to hear spoken language rather than reading it and only getting our own interpretation of it. Okay, so what do I mean when I'm talking about text versus subtext? So text is the literal thing that you're seeing or reading. So text is, if the scene is about two people seeing each other and one says hey and the other says hey. That's the text. That's literally what is happening. But the subtext is what's implied and is usually the emotional meaning. So you might have two people who see each other in the scene and they both say hey, but the subtext there could be, wow, I'm really surprised to see you here because last time I saw you, we got into a huge fight and I thought I would never see you again. So this is shocking, but I'm very happy to see you, right? You don't want all of that dialogue to be in your scene, but conveying all of that emotion in just, hey, that's the reason that actors are paid so much. And then the other person says, hey, back, and the subtext there could be, I thought about our fight and I realized that I love you more than I care about whatever we were fighting about, so I'm here to support you and love you. And so you have just a scene where two people see each other and say, hey, they each say, hey, but the subtext is so much richer. So I really encourage you guys to, as we watch the movies in this class, to be thinking about what emotions are implied and what is the subtext in each scene. And how does inflection in dialogue, or how does performance, or the emotion on the actors' faces, or even shot choices or things like that, how do those communicate subtext? Okay, so there are two main types of spoken language in film, and that's the monologue and the dialogue. And monologues are not always voiceover, but sometimes they are. And they're most often associated with documentaries. So it might be an off-screen narrator, or it might be someone in the film kind of like telling a story or something. That's a monologue. And monologue is typically used to either convey some kind of like using voiceover to convey some kind of exposition that we're not able to be shown, or maybe sometimes it's like the internal monologue of the character, or something that we can't see. That's what monologue is usually. And it doesn't always have to be voiceover. It can be actually in the scene, but most of the time it is voiceover. So then moving into dialogue, one of the really cool things, interesting things about film is that dialogue is often not necessary. So it can be a very powerful tool, but the most powerful thing, or the thing that film can do that no other medium really can do, is express emotion just like silently, just through expression, because we can get so close. So you can get very, very close to someone's face and see very intimate details of their expression to understand what they're thinking and feeling. And your book makes the point that theater can't be that way. Theater has to be a lot more, it has to use a lot more dialogue in order to convey certain points or emotions or whatever else, because so often you're very far away. So then we kind of move on into the area of subtitles and dubbed films. So one of my favorite quotes was by the director of Parasite, who said, "Once you overcome the 1-inch tall barrier of subtitles, you will be introduced to so many more amazing films." So a lot of people don't really like subtitled films because they don't like to read while they're watching movies. Or some people also don't like subtitled films because they can't really understand the nuance of the inflection of the dialogue. Because if you're unfamiliar with a language, you don't know the typical cadence. So you don't know when certain inflections are being used or something like that. So that reasoning, whether good or bad, that reasoning kind of led to the idea of dubbed films, which, is what we saw with Spirited Away. So Spirited Away is a dubbed film. It was originally done in Japanese, and the version that we watched was redubbed in English. And, sometimes it works. I think in Spirited Away it works. And sometimes it doesn't work. I think there are a lot of examples of films or TV shows or whatever where it doesn't work. But the concept of dubbing a film seems like it would be the superior way to have audiences watch a film that's not in their native language. Like theoretically, it seems like it would be that way. Like take this film that was done in one language and redub it in another language, and that should be an easy transition. But it's actually the opposite. So movie-going audiences really do not like dubbed films, and there are a lot of reasons for that. But even though people don't really love subtitles, they're much more likely to go see a movie that has subtitles rather than a dubbed film, because dubbed films are typically done kind of poorly. That's actually it for our sound lecture, and next week we'll be talking about acting.